Hey Optimancers, Chris here. When Tasha's Cauldron of Everything came out, the Rune Knight kind of became the way we could have our player character become large as a bonus action without using concentration. It was available before with Enlarge Reduce, but that required concentration and also required an action. And with Rune Knight, we could do it with a bonus action. And eventually, we could become huge sized. And if we were to throw an Enlarge Reduce on there, we could actually even eventually become gargantuan. Now, here's the real question. What if we picked up a Gargantuan Greatsword? How much damage would it do? I've heard that weapon would do 8d6 damage per hit, and that is amazing. Now, the player's handbook doesn't say anything about that, nor does the Rune Knight subclass, nor does the Enlarge Reduce spell. So where does this come from, and is it legal by the rules as written? So let's dive into the rules we use for player characters in today's video. But before we do that, if you'd be interested in supporting the content of this channel, I have a link to my Patreon page in the video description. Patrons of this channel receive rewards such as ad-free early releases of these videos, and my top-level patrons can join me for some D&D each month. Today is a deep dive into the rules of D&D. Let's get started. So first, let's discuss where this all comes from. If we discuss oversized weapons, this quote is definitely going to come up. Big monsters typically wield oversized weapons that deal extra dice of damage on a hit. Double the weapon dice if the creature is large, triple the weapon dice if it's huge, and quadruple the weapon dice if it's gargantuan. For example, a huge giant wielding an appropriately sized great axe deals 3d12 slashing damage, plus its strength bonus, instead of the normal 1d12. A creature has disadvantage on attack rolls with a weapon that is sized for a larger attacker. You can rule that a weapon size for an attacker 2 or more sizes larger is too big for the creature to use at all. This is what we see quoted whenever we talk about a player character using a large or bigger weapon. Double the damage if the weapon is large, triple if it's huge, and quadruple the weapon dice if it's gargantuan. A greatsword normally does 2d6 damage, so if we quadruple that, then it's 8d6. If the PC isn't the right size, they have disadvantage to use the weapon, and they may be unable to use the weapon if it's 2 sizes too big for them. So where do we find this rule? Well, we have to go to our Dungeon Master's Guide, specifically page 278, under the instructions for DMs to create new monsters. And here's where we run into our problem. The rule involves guidelines for creating new monsters, not for player characters using big weapons, or at least not specifically for that. But the question is, does it apply to player characters anyways? Did the designers decide to throw the rules for weapon sizes for player characters in the Dungeon Master's Guide under custom monster generation? Does that not strike anybody else as odd? Did they really intend for this to be a tool for players to build their characters with? In order to answer that, we must answer this question first. Are the rules for monsters and player characters the same? Because this is clearly a rule for monster design. Of that there can be no debate. If you read the section the rule appears, it is clearly a rule for monster design. So if rules for monsters and player characters are the same, it absolutely applies to player characters. If they aren't, then it absolutely doesn't. Unfortunately, and admittedly, this is my opinion, but not one that isn't developed by significant evidence, is that unless the rules specify otherwise, and sometimes they do, the rules for player characters and monsters are not the same. Now, the examples are too many to list, but here's a sampling. If we look at wizard subclasses, we see the School of Abjuration. According to the section on this subclass, these wizards are called abjurers. So, what is the hit die for an abjurer? What dice do they use for their hit points? Well, if we look at the player's handbook, it says d6. But if we look in Volo's Guide to Monsters, it says D8. Why don't they match? Well, it's either a mistake or the rules for monsters and player characters are different. So, in my opinion, our Abjurer, that is a player character, has to take the D6, because the rules for the Abjurer in Volo's Guide to Everything is rules for monsters, and in this case, an NPC Abjurer. Although a player character can be an Abjurer as well, it doesn't get to use the rules for monsters, even if it means that the player characters get less than the monsters do for the same thing. How about the Monster Manual? Here's a direct quote from the Monster Manual. A melee weapon deals 1 extra die of damage when a bugbear hits with it. So, if we play a bugbear, do we add a die of damage? Again, in my opinion, no, because this is a rule for a monster, in this case a bugbear. Although a player character can be a bugbear, it doesn't get to use the rules for monsters, even if it means that player characters get less than monsters do for the exact same thing. We can go on and on with these examples, to the point where I think anyone who claims that the rules for monsters apply to player characters has no leg to stand on. So if monster rules don't apply to player characters even when it's the same thing, what are we supposed to do if a player character picks up a monster's weapon? For example, let's say we have a huge-sized player character and they fight a fire giant. That fire giant's greatsword delivers 66 damage, according to the rules for that monster. So, if we pick it up, does it do 66 damage? Well, not necessarily. Once again, we can provide examples to show that. We don't have to go far, in fact. That same fire giant threw a huge rock at us, which did 4d10 damage. Do we get to pick up a huge rock and do 4d10 damage? That doesn't even seem to match, does it? Does a medium-sized rock do 1d10 plus 1/3 of 1d10 damage? And why does a storm giant pick up that same rock that the fire giant just threw for 4d10, but they're going to do 4d12 with it? Which one do we use? What is the damage of a huge-sized rock? Or maybe the rock is a special feature of the giant, like a racial ability or something. But does it actually say that anywhere under the creature features? No. It just has, under the various weapon attacks, that one of the options is rock, and here's the damage. It's almost like they never intended player characters to pick up that rock and do the same damage. And that's because, and again, this is my opinion, that they didn't intend that. Just like the Bugbear PC can't use the Monster Manual to determine weapon damage, and the Abjurer can't use Volos to determine hit dice, and the Minotaur can't use the Monster Manual to be large-sized. These rules for monsters simply do not apply to player characters. So what happens if our player character is using a large-sized weapon? A greatsword that is large-sized does 46 damage in the hands of a large monster. So why wouldn't it in the hands of another large-sized creature? Just because they're a player character? And I don't know the answer, but I can say that it doesn't, and we can demonstrate that too. If you cast the Enlarge Reduce spell, and change from medium-sized to large-sized, according to the spell, the weapons become large-sized as well. To quote the spell directly, the target's weapons also grow to match its new size. While these weapons are enlarged, the target's attacks with them deal 1d4 extra damage. So a large-sized player character wielding a large-sized greatsword does 2d6 plus 1d4 damage, not 4d6, at least according to the Enlarge Reduce spell. What can we say for sure is that this does not match the rules for custom monsters using big weapons. What we can also say for sure is this is a rule for player characters. Now, can we apply this across the board? Does a player character using a large-sized weapon do an additional d4? Maybe huge size 2d4? Gargantuan 3d4? Well, not so fast. This is indeed a rule for player characters, but it's also a spell effect, not a general rule for weapons. If this was the general rule for weapons, they needed to put it in the player's handbook under equipment weaponry, not in the text of a spell. Just like with the rules for custom monsters. This rule is just not in the right place to apply to weapons in a general sense. So where does that leave us? Well, where it leaves us is this. There is actually only one rule we can say for certain applies to player characters in regards to size and the size of weapons. Creatures that are small or tiny have disadvantage on attack rolls with heavy weapons. A heavy weapon's size and bulk make it too large for a small or tiny creature to use effectively. We know that this applies to player characters in a general sense because we find it in the player's handbook under weapons where those rules are. However, in the player's handbook, there are no rules for oversized weapons beyond that. The text of a spell is not weapon rules. The text in the Dungeon Master's Guide under creating custom monsters is not weapon rules for player characters. And that's our answer. There are no rules. There are guidelines for the creation of monsters. These guidelines, again in my opinion, are placed there for one purpose: to help a DM create monster stat blocks. There are rules for enlarged weapons through the enlarge reduce spell, and well under the effects of that spell, clearly that is the rule you should use. There are rules for small or tiny creatures using heavy weapons, and that is all we have. So, does that mean our Gargantuan player picks up a Gargantuan Greatsword and it does 2d6 damage? Technically, by rules as written, that's what it means. But this is why we have a Dungeon Master, and the answer really should be not necessarily. The base assumption of the rule is that a Greatsword in the hands of a player character does 2d6 damage, and that is true. But it is the DM's job to fill in these gaps when the rules don't cover something. So yes, a DM could use the rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide for custom monsters as a guide for player characters using these weapons. Or they could use Enlarge Reduce as a guide. Or they could come up with their own ruling. But by rules as written, they need do nothing at all. When it comes to the rules, some apply to player characters, some apply to monsters, and some apply to both. How do we know which is which? Well, to some extent, the title of the book might give you a clue. But actually, for the most part, it tells you. Rules in the player's handbook apply to player characters, except in some cases it explicitly says otherwise. For example, under the combat section in the player's handbook it says, and I quote, "This section provides the rules you need for your player characters and monsters to engage in combat, whether it is a brief skirmish or an extended conflict in a dungeon or on a field of battle. Throughout this section, the rules address you, the player or Dungeon Master. The Dungeon Master controls all the monsters and non-player characters involved in combat, and each other player controls an adventurer. You, in quotes, can also mean the character or monster you control." So why does it have that section saying it applies to both player characters and monsters? Because in this case it does. Now that doesn't mean that other rules might not apply to player characters and monsters, but that ends up being in the realm of the DM. And that's the important thing. It's in the realm of the DM. It is not for the players to choose. So here's the big question. What if you are the DM? Is it really going to be an issue to use the custom monster rules for oversized weapons in regards to player characters? Couldn't we just let players look through the monster manual and allow them to use the weapon blocks for monsters? Isn't giving players more options a good thing? I know I've certainly said so before, so I think I better talk about that more, and I will in my next video. So until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.